All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to Laura. Thanks to Tina. Thank you to Terry. I appreciate the invitation to present to you all today and to kind of lead a bit of a discussion on what we like to call cultural humility. I know the title for this session was Addressing Bias and Racism in the Classroom. That is definitely an integral part of what we're going to be talking about today. Um, and we're going to talk about anti-racism and cultural humility in the context of how to bring some of these ideas into the classroom. And Laurel with New Mexico PBS will be able to provide a bunch more materials for you. There's a wealth of information on PBS's websites and learning series and all different kinds of programs that they're able to offer. And I'll show you a few of those today as we go through the conversation. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here so you can see the slides. So I'm going to do that real quick.
And a quick reminder, you can double click on Courtney's screen to make it larger and make the rest of us smaller.
So hopefully everyone can see the slides here, okay? I'm gonna, in order to be able to monitor you all as well as the slides here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna keep this this size instead of going to full screen sometimes. So sometimes you'll see the slides in skeleton mode here, but hopefully it's not too bad. So we're calling this Working Toward Cultural Humility. And just to show you a few of the learning objectives for today, we're going to define and understand racism and cultural humility. We're going to try to understand the principles of anti-racism and cultural humility and explore the value of applying cultural humility to adult education. Okay, so yesterday, Laurel, I actually think did a wonderful job going through the slides, even though you all were unable to hear or see me, which was unfortunate. But today I get to explain a little more about what you're seeing here and how this relates to the presentation today. The man in the middle talking to these children is my grandfather. His name is Jerry Dunnigan. He is a former Black Panther from the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. I was born in Chicago, and most of my family is from Chicago as well. He was a Chicago chapter Black Panther member. He is here talking to some children during what was known as the Free Breakfast Program that was run at that time. Many of you may know the Black Panther Party had breakfast and medical programs for communities. They like to refer to those as survival programs. To my surprise, this photo has become fairly popular within Black Panther lore. As a matter of fact, my father-in-law, hopefully you can see my mouse here, my father-in-law bought me this book because he knew that my grandfather was a Black Panther, and he didn't know the photo was in the book until I started reading the book, and I showed him, hey, check it out, that's my grandfather in this book. So I love that. And then my wife and I were watching this documentary a few years ago, Black Panther's Vanguard of the Revolution, which you can also see on PBS as well. And lo and behold, there's the photo again in the documentary. And I've come across the photo several other times as well. So I just thought it was interesting to show you why it's so important to me to talk about anti-racism and try to work towards anti-racism, because literally it's in my blood. As a matter of fact, my mother, here at the time she was Renetta Frazier, and now she's Renetta Dunnigan Greathouse. Renetta Dunnigan Greathouse, formerly Renetta Frazier, sued the city of Springfield, Illinois for racial discrimination while she was a police officer. And you can see here some of the those who joined the lawsuit. The Black Guardians is what they were known as. They formed a group as Black police officers called the Black Guardians, and they filed a lawsuit against the Springfield, Illinois Police Department, and they worked with the NAACP chapter in that area to bring about lots and lots of reforms to the way law enforcement is done in Springfield. So once again, right to my bone, anti-racism is very, very important to me. So what is racism? So here's a few different definitions, and I wanted to show you these just to kind of give you an idea of why is there so much confusion around race and racism? And some of the questions that you may be asked in your classroom about race, you'll see that so many misunderstandings come out. And I think the reason for that is because there's really two levels to think about racism. Once we get beyond the fact that race is not a biological reality necessarily, but rather it's a social construct, we can look at these two, definitions and kind of see that. So for instance, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism against a particular racial or ethnic group, or the belief that different races possess distinct characteristics to distinguish them as inferior or superior to one another. Those are dictionary definitions that focus mostly on the individual, right? This is a focus on the individual person and the kind of personal beliefs and judgments that they hold themselves. But Ibram X. Kendi, a very popular anti-racist educator, and he's the author of a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist that was published last year. He calls it the marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequalities. And you can see that Ibram X. Kendi has taken the definition from the individual towards the systems, towards the institutions in our society that perpetuate racism, that normalize racial inequalities. And that is where the real struggle is. And I want to show you a clip from Ibram X. Kendi, and also speaking with Robin DiAngelo, another anti-racist educator, talking about the difference between anti-racism and not racist. So let's take a look at this clip here.
Protests over the recent deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor have sparked a renewed dialogue on racism in America. Advocates for reform want policy and governmental changes, but there are also questions about what we can do as individuals to recognize our own inherent racism and to work to change that. As part of our Race Matters series, Amna Nawaz spoke earlier with two scholars to explore racism in America and the concept of anti-racism. Ibram X. Kendi is the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he's a professor of history and the founding director of the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research. Robin DiAngelo is the author of the book White Fragility and is a consultant and educator on racial and social justice issues.
So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's jump right in because words matter when we have this discussion, and I want to talk about definitions. So Ibram, let's start with you. A lot of people will say, look, I'm not racist, but in your book you argue that's not enough. You have to be anti-racist. So what exactly does that mean? What's the difference?
So I define anti-racist as someone who is expressing an anti-racist idea or supporting an anti-racist policy with their action. And very quickly, an anti-racist idea suggests that there's nothing wrong or right, superior or inferior about any racial group. And anti-racist policies are policies that are leading to equity and justice. So the people who are expressing those types of ideas and supporting those types of policies in those moments, they're being anti-racist. And part of being anti-racist is having the willingness to admit the times in which we're being racist. While to be not racist is always to say, even after we just said something that's racist, I'm not racist.
So just to clarify then, even though your book is entitled How To, this isn't some status you achieve, right? Once you're anti-racist, you're always anti-racist?
No, anti-racist isn't a fixed category. So I don't urge people to become anti-racist. I urge people to be anti-racist. In many ways, being anti-racist is almost like overcoming an addiction. And the first process of overcoming an addiction is first admitting that you have an addiction to racism. And then secondly, spending every day of your life ensuring that you're no longer going back to that, ensuring that you're being anti-racist.
So Robin, let's talk about white fragility then. You talk in your book about the need to embrace anti-racism. How does white fragility fit into this conversation?
The answer to that is connected to what Ibram had just said about denial. We have to start with breaking denial. And one of the challenges is that we've been taught to think about racism as only occurring in individual moments perpetrated by individual people who consciously and intentionally mean to harm other people. And as long as we define it that way, the average white person is not going to see themselves as complicit. When you understand that it's actually the system that we're in, that it's infused across the society, that changes your question from if you are or are not racist to how am I either upholding or challenging racism. But that denial sets us up to be.
So hopefully everyone was able to see that video okay. And you can see the importance of looking at racism away from the individual perspective to the institutions and the systems and processes that produces those racial inequalities. And that's where the real address is. And there's another way to look at racism as you bring this information into your classrooms and as you are working with different cultures and people who have different needs and have different backgrounds. There's a way to talk about race in particular and some of the misunderstandings around what race even is. And PBS has this wonderful tool here from their series called Race, the Power of an Illusion. I watched this entire series as a college student at the University of Missouri, so I was really grateful to have this resource while I was there. But this is an interactive tool, as you can see here, and it just kind of goes through some of the most basic ideas about race and the misunderstandings. Race has no genetic basis. You know, slavery predates racial inequalities. As a matter of fact, race and freedom were born together in the United States. The concept of equality was a radical new idea, and freedom was intimately tied with the concept of race. And race justified social inequalities as natural and biological. A lot of you know about the science of eugenics and the science of forced sterilizations and the science of measuring brain sizes and skull sizes and how that related to racial inequalities. Human subspecies don't exist. We do not have subcategories of humans in Homo sapiens, for instance. Skin color is only skin deep. And one of the big ones is that most variation occurs within races, not between races. Two random Koreans are likely to be as genetically different as a Korean and an Italian. So this is another good resource to visit pbs.org/race and to share these resources with folks who just need some basic and quick information on what race is to kind of dispel some of those myths. So going back to the slides here, critical aspects of racism, as we know, implicit bias, right? Unconsciously holding attitudes and beliefs towards others and associating stereotypes with them. Racism produces structural inequality, right? The structure and the processes of institutions and systems, intentionally or unintentionally, privilege some groups and disadvantage others. And of course, cultural absolutism, right? It's that dominant cultures or institutions not only resist structural changes, they often scapegoat and deny that large-scale problems exist. We see that in our political dialogue to this day. They resist structural change. And because of that, because they're upholding those aspects of the institutions, they then coerce cultural assimilation. So they do not value diversity at its deepest aspect. Instead, they say that you must exist within a larger oppressive cultural norm. Here's a video specifically on implicit bias that PBS put together. We're not going to watch the whole thing. We'll watch just a few minutes of it to give you an idea of what implicit bias is and how it manifests in our behaviors. And it's just a wonderful resource to be able to share.
Implicit bias exists when we unconsciously hold attitudes towards others or associate stereotypes with them. For example, we often harbor negative stereotypes about others without consciously realizing that we do so. Implicit bias, which is also called unconscious bias or implicit social cognition, is a prejudice that is deep-seated within the brain, below the conscious level. Studies have demonstrated implicit bias against racial groups, genders, LGBTQ, and other marginalized groups. We may even be prejudiced against our own group, although we tend to favor our in-group with positive stereotypes and disfavor out-groups with negative stereotypes.
The immediate feeling you get or the immediate thoughts you have about a person, an assumption you feel, just anything you feel really stems somewhere from an experience you've had or your upbringing.
Depends on the region you're from, the country you're from, the background you grew up in. That shapes the person's unconscious bias.
I think sometimes you don't even realize it, but your own actions, maybe the way you treat others as opposed to treating others that look like you or that act like you or that are your friends.
Implicit bias often runs counter to people's conscious, expressed beliefs. Few physicians espouse racially discriminatory views, and yet doctors tend to recommend less pain medication for Black patients than for white patients with the identical injury. In other words, people can be explicitly unbiased, yet implicitly biased, according to psychologist Daniel Tilley and colleagues.
One of my closest friends since high school, we've worked on a lot of projects together. We've been in a lot of classes together. Sometimes we'd be working together in a group project, for example, and she would say stuff like, oh, you're good at math, you're good at science. Here, you can take this part of the project or something. I don't hold it against her or anything, and she doesn't mean any harm by it. But obviously, there's that implicit sort of bias or stereotype that Asians are better at math and science.
Implicit bias.
Okay, so there's more to that video. Again, I hope everyone was able to view that okay, and please let me know in the chat if you were not able to see it. And it just goes a lot more into one of the most popular resources in measuring implicit bias is indeed the implicit association test, the IAT test, which you can take right now if you want to. You can go online and find at least a couple of different versions of it, but the most popular version is from Harvard. And it shows you different images and associations, and you'll be very surprised at how many implicit biases that we hold, particularly related to race and gender and sexual orientation and in various other categories. So I would encourage everyone to take the implicit association test in your own time when you get a chance. Critical aspects of racism, how does it lead to different inequalities, and how are those manifest as processes and systems and institutions? Well, one of the starkest examples, of course, that affects us right here in New Mexico and around the country started in 1970 with Nixon's Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. Nixon called drugs public enemy #1 at that time. Of course, that led to the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act with Ronald Reagan, which eventually led to Clinton's passing of the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act in 1994. In 1994 specifically, it linked federal school funding to reporting student behavior and mandated zero tolerance policies. And some of you may be familiar with this next term, which is the gradual evolution of all three of these inherently biased policies, which led to what we now call today the school to prison pipeline. And the ACLU definition here is a good one to take with you. And let's see a couple of more minutes of a really wonderful video that summarizes the school to prison pipeline and how it affects young students and children of color, and how it reproduces inequalities in our society.
What would you do if your child was placed in handcuffs for crying at school? Well, this was a reality for a 7-year-old Black boy in Missouri, and it isn't rare for Black and brown kids across the country. Whether it's getting arrested for talking back or doodling on the desk, in-school policing is harming students by taking them out of school and helping funnel them into prisons. It's called the school to prison pipeline. We're talking about a structure of codes and punishments that criminalizes kids as early as preschool and increases their chances of ending up in the criminal justice system. 99% of New York City school children who were handcuffed in 2016 were Black or Latinx. This happens when school resource officers are called into classrooms to discipline students, sometimes for something as small as violating a dress code or grabbing candy from a teacher's desk. If the offense doesn't lead to an arrest, Black and brown students are still subject to harsher punishments than white students. Black students are 4 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. Sometimes students are kicked out of school for basically just being Black. Like in cases across the country where Black girls were suspended for rocking braids or an afro. So, where do students go after they've been kicked out of school? Research shows they're 3 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system within a year. This is all part of an endless cycle. Once kids touch the juvenile justice system, they're 67% more likely to end up in jail again before they're 25. So, what lessons are schools and police really teaching our kids here? How can kids excel in school if they're always being kicked out of them?
Okay, so school to prison pipeline as a gradual evolution of the policies from the 60s and the 70s and the 90s that reproduces these inequalities in our society. And we know today that there are various other examples of how this plays out. You can just see it across so many different groups in the conversations that are happening today. As an adult, you don't get to escape some of the inequalities that you see in your schooling. As an adult, you are hyper-policed and treated as a danger to your society, which then, of course, reproduces this gross inequality of police violence against people of color. We know that displacement is another example of what comes out of racist policies. For instance, we saw that with the Standing Rock movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline. I want to bring your attention to this photo here that says, "We want white tenants in our white community." This was from the 60s, but you may be surprised to know that this was Detroit. This photo comes from Detroit, not Alabama, not Montgomery, not Atlanta, right? This is Detroit in the 60s and 70s. And of course, one of the conversations that probably doesn't get nearly as much attention as it should, this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, both here in New Mexico, there's a movement, as well as the large-scale movement around this country and in Canada specifically. And of course, the ongoing conversation around exploitation of Native and Indigenous communities, particularly manifested in sports logos. So this is a lot of the different conversations that are going on today. And I see that there's some good conversation going on in the chat, and hopefully we can get to that towards the end of the conversation. I'm taking a look at time, and I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit to some solutions, some things that we can consider to move forward as a society and use some of the skills and the models that we have to address some of these inequalities and bring these conversations into our classrooms specifically. This presentation was adapted from one that my wife and I gave, and we're calling it cultural humility. And this is a term that was coined in the 90s by Turvalon and Murray Garcia. Here is a simple definition, but I want to show you a little bit of a clip from a documentary that was made on cultural humility to give you a little bit more information about what we're talking about here.
Just us. there are these moments that grab everybody's attention that we can take advantage of. And I think the Rodney King, more of the response to Rodney King is what inspired a lot of conversation and a lot of soul searching and a lot of people seeking ways that we could have these conversations in with better result. And then, you know, it fades.
The 3 police officers facing felony criminal charges were among a group of 15 who stopped a 25-year-old black man last Saturday night, then beat him, kicked him, and clubbed him.
At WHAT Radio, host Mary Mason fielded scores of calls from members of the black community, angered by the verdict,
it is open war against black folks.
shocked by the violence that followed.
We need to love and respect one another. We need to stop.
In 2010, Arizona passed a law that authorized local police to check the immigration status of anyone of whom they suspect of being an illegal immigrant to the United States, and who has the right to call another human being illegal. Most of these illegals are the ones working in the fields, cleaning homes, landscaping, or jobs that have the right to pay lower than minimum wage.
There are things that are difficult to hear, and there are things that are just plain hard to see. So, you know how it is, a fish doesn't see water. It's very hard when you benefit from great privilege to see it as that. And I would say it takes constant reminding. And I certainly don't see it all the time. And each time I'm reminded of it, I'm reminded that I'm reminded of it. That why do I have to be reminded of it? Oh, but I do.
I heard the white woman behind us say, "You foreigners have no manners." My initial reaction was anger and confusion. Anger because I felt discriminated against and judged. Confusion because she was an older woman, so hadn't she been around long enough to know that she is not a native of this country either? We are constantly bombarded by subliminal messages that light skin is superior. Immigration policy is continuously debated in the White House, while brown men are hoping to land a side job outside of Home Depot.
So that is a clip from the documentary that was made on cultural humility, and you can see that you can find this complete on YouTube. And it's cultural humility is just a really wonderful example of how you can use a model that everyone can kind of bring to their awareness in their everyday actions to kind of move past our implicit biases and move past our own misunderstandings of others' cultures. And we move from cultural competence to cultural humility as a lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, not an endpoint to an understanding, but a constant process of connecting and creating equal ground between partners, recognizing and challenging power imbalances for respectful partnerships. And of course, knowing that now we have a humble approach to how we work together, we need to hold institutions accountable for the ways that they reproduce inequalities. And of course, you may have heard of this term cultural competence. It was very popular in the 80s and 90s, but the conversation has shifted really towards cultural humility. And that's because cultural competence had a tendency to think that knowledge of others can be complete, that somehow you develop mastery of another's culture if you spend enough time with them and have enough conversations and go on enough discovery trips to their countries and their communities and volunteer and give back, that somehow you can become an expert on someone else's culture. But cultural humility says, no, actually, we're equal partners in this process. And it's an ongoing process of developing knowledge. And the reason for that is simply because sometimes there can be greater differences within a culture than between cultures. And just like there's just not just one kind of white person, although white people share similarities, each white person is unique and different, and the same is for other cultures. I'm a Black person. I have an affinity with other Black people. I have a common history with other Black people. I grew up in their same neighborhoods. but there are many things about me that are different and unique, and that makes me specifically me. And so cultural humility says, let's continue to learn about each other's cultures and about each other as well. So let's try to move through this, so maybe we can make some time for a little bit of conversation and to address some of the information that's in the chat here. I just want to talk about what can we do. The current conversation is about addressing all of these specific things. And there's this really funny term called cancel culture. Some of you may be familiar with it. And it's just like, basically, like, we got to end it all, right? We got to like address the police and take down the monuments, and you know, the Entrada is now out, and, you know, we got to address the family separation policies at the border and all these different things. We just got to end it all, right? We got to fight back and end it all. And of course, this is causing a really tense conversation in our community. And I think the reason is because we all bring so many of our passions for each of these issues to the conversation, and it becomes difficult to have a conversation when those passions are there. But there are other models that we can take on that allows us to move forward together. There's one model called Transformational Leadership. I'm a co-facilitator with a group in town called the Emerging Social Sector Leaders Program, and we just completed our 7th cohort, so that's 7 years now. And we use this model called Transformational Leadership. We do trainings and discussions and facilitated events with our cohort to talk about different leadership models that can actually move the entire social sector forward, not just benefiting the individual or the organization, but the entire sector. And we all bring some of these different ideas with us, and we don't have to master all 4 of them, for instance. And it doesn't have to be just this 4, for instance, but we all bring 1 or more of these to the table, and all of them are represented at the table. So then the entire sector moves forward. You know, we can look at the differences between transformational leadership and transactional leadership. And don't worry if you're not familiar with these terms, that's quite all right. Think of transactional leadership as a leader who expects to get things in return from what he gives. So think of a transactional leader as someone who employs a system of rewards and punishments instead of acting as a role model by adhering to ethical and moral conduct. For instance, think of a transactional leader as someone who focuses on established rules and procedures rather than the leaders challenge assumptions and take risks and help followers think outside the box. So this is another way to kind of think about how do we use our skills and our models to move the entire sector forward. We also use this idea called the village model, where we go from the individual that says, what can I bring and how can I be held accountable? And then those skills translate then to the program, the team, the organization, and we talk about how can we move the entire community forward. These are all models that can be implemented, that can be formalized in your institutions and in your classrooms as well, so that you can bring these conversations in a safe and effective manner. So here are some ideas to get started with bringing anti-racist behaviors and actions into the classroom. Of course, one of the big ones today is challenging misinformation and the whitewashing of history. And of course, we have to counter our own stereotypes and implicit bias. I want to leave a few minutes for conversation. There's a lot more to be talked about here. I hope that it was a useful conversation and exploration for everyone here, but how do we do it? Can we unmute microphones and allow video, and maybe folks can offer some feedback on how to bring anti-racism and cultural humility into your work?
So, hey.
Hi.
My name is Peggy. I'm from Union Valencia, and I do training, a coach training. And something that I've noticed lately, are you getting feedback?
I
Okay. is this idea of focus on growth mindset and grit and persistence. And I think that that's a new way to say bootstrap. And I feel like focusing on these things puts the complete responsibility on the student without the institutions having to look at themselves, and also dismissing institutional bias and societal bias. And I just wanted to get your feedback on that, please.
Thank you, Peggy, and it's nice to see you and meet you, and thanks for joining the conversation today. I've heard that term growth mindset, and I can't say that I am particularly knowledgeable about the various elements of that model, but I would totally agree to ensure that not all of the impetus for change is placed on the individual, particularly more vulnerable individuals such as children, and particularly children of color in various ways. Yeah, absolutely. The institution has a much larger role to play. The institution is often able to set a cultural norm within groups and communities and projects so that you can model a particular behavior, and as opposed to saying that the child just has to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and kind of take on all of the responsibility that way.
I've seen lately on Pinterest a lot, on teacher sets, and even on Facebook.
Fortunately,
your grades, your homework, everything.
So
Yeah, it
sorry,
seems like
Peggy, you're
a
breaking
bit.
up, so we couldn't hear you. We only have a couple minutes left, actually 1 minute. So I was hoping you could answer Amy's question. How do you respond to people that say that Black students who are suspended deserve it because of how they're behaving?
Yes. Thank you, Amy, for the question. So how do you respond to people say that Black students who are suspended are somehow displaying poor character? I would talk about that. So the schools that I went to most of my life were largely diverse and mixed schools, Black, white, Latinx, and some Asian students. And I would definitely say that the suspension rate for students of color were a much higher rate. And I would say for that, so there are two things to think of here. Displaying poor character, of course, we know that that's historically, can be a racist thing to say. We know that institutions like to categorize diverse cultures as somehow not modern, or lacking in character traits and things like that. I would say that students of color quite often are coming from much more precarious situations. They could potentially have more unstable living situations. They could have other kinds of traumas. There are adverse childhood experiences that are specific to students of color that they bring with them to the classroom. And one thing I like to always say is, you bring your whole life with you to the classroom. You don't suddenly change into a different person when you walk in the door at school. No, institutions, the schools themselves have a role to play to create good learning environments, and environments where students can actually maximize their potential instead of steadily trying to move past their own experiences. And yeah, okay, I mean, yes, kids can make better decisions, and there are kinds of decisions that young people can learn to make. And I totally, think that that's a good thing to bring out in our learning environments. But to put the impetus solely on the most vulnerable party, which is the child, is just a lack of responsibility on the part of the institution.
Okay, so I think we're out of time, but that was awesome. You did a much better job than I did, for sure. Thanks, everyone. I think this was probably recorded so you can get access to it again, and we will let you know. But thanks, everyone, for joining us. Please head back to the Commons area and onto the stage, and probably Terry will be drawing for another prize. And then at this 5 of 10, I will be presenting on PBS Learning Media 101. Bye, everyone.